And I'll move straight on to the first presentation from Christopher Shaw.
Thanks to the organisers for giving us a chance to speak today. I don't think I'll speak as quickly as Andrew Sims, but I think I can speak as loudly as him, so hopefully we shall see. Okay, so part of the work that I do is for the Environmental Change Institute, and I work on a project called the Climate Crunch, which is taking the work of 6 ESRC Climate Change Leadership Fellowships, synthesising that research and trying to present it to policymakers to try and get them to re-engage with the climate policy debate. And what that shares with this event is a sense that climate policy has run into the sand. There's something of an impasse in climate policy, and we need to rethink some of the core assumptions which underlie our approach. And what I'm going to talk about today is not results of research that I'm doing as part of the Environmental Change Institute. It's to do with some other work, and it builds on also work that's been done by some other people who are here today. And so there's another element of that climate policy debate, a foundational issue, which is coming onto the agenda, and that's the idea that we need to start thinking about what, if anything, should replace the idea of a 2-degree dangerous limit to climate change. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And what I'm going to be saying is that's a great opportunity that debate is emerging now. I'm going to propose that debate should be inclusive and democratic, and so that actually this is a great opportunity for that to happen. And through that process of building an inclusive and democratic debate about how much warming is too much, what is an acceptable level of climate risk, I'm going to make the claim that that is going to lead to that radical reframing of climate risks in the public discourse, and hopefully engage people in a more positive fashion with the climate policy debate. So I'll start with the conclusions in case I run out of time, can't get to them at the end. So what I'm first going to do is talk about how the idea of a 2-degree dangerous limit is currently represented in the public sphere. Then I'm going to outline why I think that's a problem, why we might seek to change it, how we might seek to change it, and then very briefly I'm going to touch on one possible mechanism for engaging a global population in a debate about how much warming is too much warming. And that's necessarily speculative. As I say, this isn't research that funded research I'm doing, but it's just the work I'm doing is sort of leading to this type of conclusion. So those are the 3 things I'm going to try and cover today. Now this graph, good, that's clear. So I titled this not in front of the children, because when I did research I've done into how the idea of a 2-degree knowable dangerous limit is represented in the public sphere, that was a sense I got, look, don't pick at it, don't expose it. Okay, it's got a lot of weaknesses, but it's the best idea we've got, and there's nothing else out there. So if you criticise that, and if that disappears off the agenda, we've got nothing. So this sense of not in front of the children was very much prominent in my discussions and interviews, etc. I've done. And here's an example of this. So this is from a paper published in Global Environmental Change earlier this year, and it compares mentions of global warming in the UK national press 2000-2012 with mentions of 2 degrees, and that's a logarithmic scale. So mentions of global warming are in the thousands per year, and 2 degrees, which is a correlate of a function of warming, 10 mentions a year. When you go up to Copenhagen, you got up to about, I think it's 121 mentions in the UK press that year. So it's really marginalised. It's not something that is discussed. It's kept off the agenda, and I would propose, I haven't got time to get into that today, that that's a conscious act of power. So what happens when it is mentioned then? On those rare occasions it is mentioned, but let's look at something that the Guardian, the most progressive paper in the UK, or national paper, mainstream paper, how do they do that? But on the eve of Copenhagen, they put together this joint editorial. So I'll just quote from what they said. Today, 56 newspapers in 45 countries take the unprecedented step of speaking with one voice through a common editorial. So that is, a unique media event, and that's across the globe. And this, when it came to discussing 2 degrees, this is how it's presented as a scientific, objective fact. You might as well try and have a debate about how much gravity we'll have tomorrow. It's simply not debatable. It's a fact of life. It's scientific, and it's a feature, an objective feature of the climate system, that when it warms to 2 degrees, it'll become dangerous. So that's generally how it is represented in the public sphere. And so what's the consequence of these types of representations. And Matt Hope is here. He did some great work, well, they've done some great work at Carbon Brief, and they've asked people, what do you think is a dangerous limit to climate change? Now, some people said 2 degrees, as many people said 10 degrees, more people, 10 degrees, more people said 5 degrees, and the most common answer was don't know. And I think actually don't know, if it was, is probably the right answer, or if it was said not possible to know, or no such thing, then that's probably the right answer. So in one sense you think, oh gosh, there's no awareness of why we're doing these things. When I spoke to NGOs and other advocates of the 2 degree limit, they would say, well, we talk about 2 degrees because it simplifies the complex science, and it gives us some sort of hook for us when we go to people and say, we want you to make these sacrifices. Why are we asking you to make these sacrifices? Because otherwise the planets will warm by 2 degrees and it will become horrible. Well, that it hasn't succeeded as a communication device on the basis of that. But that's great, because if a debate is emerging, then it's not a case of going to the public saying, well, we got it wrong and it wasn't a scientific fact. We don't know what is a dangerous limit. It looks like it's probably going to be a lot less than 2 degrees. You could start that debate now, or so the evidence would suggest. But why would you bother? I mean, who cares really? Why not just leave it in the hands of those institutions, those people who have created the 2 degree concept already? People like Nick Pigeon have done some work which shows that if you don't communicate, if people don't understand the uncertainties in the science, and it's difficult for them to understand the risks involved. So, for example, they don't think the planet's going to be dangerously warmed until 2 degrees, the year 2100, or whatever that might be, then it's difficult to properly assess the risks that we face. Socialisation, the problem has been suggested, will improve our chances of finding a solution, let 7 billion flowers bloom, as it were. And indeed, why would you let the same people, the same institutions, the same value systems define what is going to replace the dangerous 2 degree idea, given the weaknesses and the failings of the existing concept? And you by building a more inclusive discourse, then you strengthen the social compact. More generally, you build a stronger democracy, and also in terms of environmental citizenship. And given the sorts of impacts that I feel are going to happen and that have been talked about here, I think that strong social cohesion is something that we should seek to build and achieve, and overcome the cynicism that currently sort of defines the political sphere. Well, how would you do that? How would you, when you look at what the UFN, IPCC, EU, UNFCCC say about this sort of thing, they say, is there too many C's in that? Probably was. They say that, look, this should be an inclusive debate that involves everyone on the basis of values, informed by science, but on the basis of values. They don't say it should only be the people of the West or the richest people, the most educated people should get to decide what's an acceptable level of climate risk. Now, generally, sort of work on scenario building, etc., engaging people in these sorts of deliberative events and actions revolve around workshops. You'd have facilitators, and you pull people together, and you would, in an iterative process, learn what's going on, guide these discussions, hear what people are saying, build other workshops, and develop a program where you can talk with people about the future. So 2 degrees is a story about the future. It's a scenario. We've all got stories about the future we want. So this is an accessible debate. But you can't, there isn't the time, there isn't the money to go and run these workshops on a global basis. So how could you go about building quickly some sort of debate around how much warming is too much that's based on people's values? Well, the DEC 2050 calculator is a great thing that's sort of tried to do this. It's moved to the online world in this very simple interface, and it's trying to do this around energy pathways to 2050, 80% cuts by 2050. And it's very good, but it is, in a sense, it sort of constructs its users as a petite technocrats in a way, because you're just choosing these technical pathways to a predetermined end. What I would suggest is, if you can get people, there's a previous question, what's in that blue box? Why those targets? What are the values that inform those targets? And I think that the sort of interface, which I can't show you here and go through here, because there isn't the time, could be applied to that previous question. And very briefly, you might have issues such as mobility, food, housing, consumption. And you could have, for example, I don't know, mobility could go from walking all the way up to your own private jet or whatever. You could have a range of scenarios. If you scaled up and everyone was having that lifestyle you wanted on those bases, what sort of warming would be experiencing by 2050 or 2100? What sort of impacts would arise from that? And what that sort of process might do is raise this as a discussion of a trade-off between various forms of social and economic activity against climate risk, rather than, well, everything's going to be fine as long as we don't warm the planet by 2 degrees, and we'll find some sort of technical way of keeping business as usual without that warming. And so that is my talk. And just to conclude again, citizens have been denied the opportunity to engage in this debate and deliberate on what is an acceptable level of climate risk. And I think by giving people that opportunity, we'll build stronger positive engagement in climate policy. And the goal is not to have a vote for 7 billion people to say, well, what do you think is a dangerous limit? But it's simply to open up the debate, to build recognition that there is a debate to be had. Thank you.
Now to Nicole de Bouvrie. I apologise for how I just said your name. That was the best I could manage. But yeah, you've got 10 minutes.
Yeah, let's see. Yes, so thank you for this invitation. As a philosopher, I am not going to use any numbers, so don't worry. I will talk about the responsibility for radical change. And I'm focusing on what it means to be radical, because we've used this word in quite so many ways. And I think we're not really radical enough, or we're not acknowledging everything that we need to do in order to actually be radical. Therefore, I will propose a distinction between 2 types of change. First of all, the modification, which I think includes most of the things that we've discussed here so far. These do not address fundamental issues because they allow us to continue to think within the same frameworks, same paradigms. We often talk in change of discourse. This is what I still include in the modification. We talk about paradigm shifts. These are still modifications. There's this expression, the rearranging of the deck chairs on the Titanic. Perhaps this is what we're doing. I'm not judging, I'm just saying this is not going to be the radical change that we need. Even transformation, this word, to transform, to put the same problem in a different form, is not going to address the underlying issue. So what do we need? We need a rupture with the very thing that regulates its appearance. That's what Alain Badiou says, he's a French philosopher. So this means that the underlying understanding needs to break in order for a new alternative, a new, not just a rearranging of what is already there. And I think Kevin already said a lot of things which are pretty much what I also want to say. We need now a change to the political and economic hegemony, not within, but to this framework. So maybe to clarify, we have all these kinds of discourses that are going around. Scientific discourse, political discourse, etc. These are informed by paradigms. And that's where we normally stop, because these are the conscious levels of our understanding of what it means to think or to frame. I'm proposing that underlying these paradigms is a world. And this world is the set of its modifications. And this world, or this worldview, is influenced by the episteme, which you can read by Foucault, introduced this topic. This epistemological space is the certain code of knowledge, which is underlying, this is unconscious, this is underlying all of our present thinking. So, to give an example, we see now a financialization of environmental conservation. This is what we've been talking all along. We're trying to put green terms into a financial mode of thinking. And we even call it a least cost solution. This is a financial term. And we call it maybe green economy. Again, a term that's already there. We're just transforming it and we say, oh, now we're really doing good things. But no, we're doing the same things because these are again influenced by the paradigms that we already know. And this is just an example. I'm not a, this is an example. So we don't change the underlying world or the underlying episteme. This is all well and said, but Naomi Klein said we have to put the worldview on trial. So what does radical change? Because this is an event. We need this event to happen, not the modification that we're all working on, and it's okay. But we need this radical change to change the course that we are on. This is an assumption that I make, but I think we're pretty much every person today presenting has accepted this as well. If you want to achieve radical change, this means that you shouldn't have examples. This is maybe difficult to explain to social scientists. So I'm going to try. It means that if we look at the past, any example of change, we cannot say it's radical. We can see it's a change, but we cannot say what is radical about it. Take the fact that we now know that the sun is the center of the universe, or at least the Earth is circling around the sun. We cannot, we know that there were people who thought that the Earth was the center, but we cannot relate to this other understanding of the world, which was hugely different. It had implications for everything, but we cannot understand it as a truth anymore. We can relate, but we can't imagine that. So any example of what it's going to be like after this radical change that we're trying to achieve is going to be within the framework that we already have. This is what Kevin meant when he said we need the impossible. It means that we cannot know what we want to achieve. So, no preset goals. This is, okay, no 2 degree anymore. I'm not saying this is the only way to do it, but I'm saying if we want radical change, forget the agenda that we all have. Because if we all go for our private agendas as institutions, as governments, as individuals, we're not going to make this radical change happening. And Einstein already said that a new type of thinking is essential if mankind is to survive and move to higher levels. This is nothing new. An event is as unique and unpredictable, that is to say, without horizon. So we need the impossible. This is not something that is it's unavoidable. We cannot do anything else but wanting the impossible. To achieve this, we need to move from an external responsibility. An external responsibility, I mean that an institution or an individual is responsible to achieve the agenda that his or her institution wants. We need to be responsible to the internal, to the process that is going to take place, the radical change itself. Because if we come in with all our preset goals, and we are responsible for making those goals happen, we cannot hear or listen to what the other people say, who might have to be involved even if we want to implement this goal. So this external, even a legal binding, externalized view on, for instance, making efficiency, reaching efficiency levels, this is limiting our own participation in the process of radical change. And this has huge implications if we think about that we're all here as a representative either of ourselves or of institutions or governments or companies. This means that these companies have to become responsible to creating a framework in which individual human beings, and I'm saying human as a philosopher, can actually interact together and let go of these agendas that are preset. So we have to look at decision-making models. That the input is our present understandings because we cannot move outside of the episteme that we are in, and that the output is a possibility change. And we have to understand that we cannot desire radical change without acknowledging that we may be swept off our feet or that we may lose influence or control. We need to accept that the rearranging of the deck chairs on the Titanic is not going to bring about radical emission reductions. Neither is civic unrest or revolutions in which one dictator or god or thought or ideology is replaced by another one. Another dictator, another ideology that is actually saying the same thing and is in the same pattern of thought. Nor can we wait for a crisis to emerge that we talked about today, because as Naomi Klein already said, if the crisis comes, we need to be able to present an alternative that we need to develop already, right now, to change this way of thinking. So what we need is a sense of responsibility that is both humble and urgent. And what is needed is radical change, so radical that we cannot imagine it. We need, as Robert Unger, this quote said, conceive that it could be different. But we cannot conceive how it is different, because that's already limiting the framework in which we think. So what is needed is a commitment to the impossible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that those two presentations will have provoked some questions or some comments. Are you just going to set... Okay, so whilst we set up the web link to Arizona, I'll take a couple of questions from the floor. Yeah, can we take one right at the back there, please?
Hi, Nick Bardsley, University of Reading. This is a question for Christopher Shaw. So I recently came across some data from European surveys that actually showed that quite a large majority of people are already in favour of absolute reductions in emissions. So my point is that it seems to me that you're focusing on something which may not actually be the main problem. There isn't a great deal of public support for things like overcoming corporate power. So, yeah, are you looking in the wrong place?
Yeah, I'll take one more question. Can we go over here to the left? You know what I mean, Phoebe? Yes, that's right. Thank you.
It's not so much a question, it's for Nicole, a question observation.
Could you just say who you
yes,
are,
I'm Sally Weintraub. I've edited a book, Engaging with Climate Change. I'm a psychoanalyst, and it's a multidisciplinary book, and it seeks to really go into the underbelly of things like denial and so on and so forth. Now, I absolutely agree with a lot of what you've said, Nicole, but I wanted to bring just something else in, which is that I think that currently, and there's an awful lot of reverberations of that in what people are saying today, we are actually suffering from living within a perverse culture. And the first casualty of that culture is a respect for the truth, and also a respect for somehow struggling with the conflict to maintain our human moral values. And so these are casualties of the perverse culture. So that I think there is some of, I wouldn't call it the old. I absolutely agree that when you make a change, a radical change, you can't anticipate it, you can't know it, and I'm absolutely with what you've said. But I also think that, along with the destruction of our culture and the things that stop excesses in our culture and a drive towards instrumentality, which is a theme that's being echoed again and again here, what happens is that psychically we get a parallel mirror process going on where we find it harder and harder to stay in touch with the truth. We find it easier and easier to find quick fix ways of getting rid of the truth, and so on and so forth. And that so actually, I think that re-engaging with some of that, some of our more moral sense, our ordinary moral sense, not super, morality, but our ordinary moral sense, I think it's compatible with what you're saying, but I think we need to regain a bit more internal structure and the capacity to think and feel in an honest way, and that we do know something about that. So we're not just facing some impossible thing out there, that I just wanted to put that in relation to what you've said, which I agree with.
Nicole, do you want to say anything back, or are you...
I also agree.
Well, isn't that nice? Okay, would you like to?
Yeah, if I've understood the question correctly, and I can sort of see the sense of it. I'm not certain that overcoming corporate power and reducing emissions are two separate activities, actually. And so I don't recognise that distinction. And is the 2-degree thing missing the target, if you'll forgive the pun? Well, it's been mentioned a lot here, and indeed, if you're looking to reduce emissions, why are you looking to reduce emissions? Why bother reducing emissions? It must be to avoid something, prevent something happening. If it's to prevent harm or catastrophic climate change, whatever it might be, then what our understanding of that catastrophic climate change is needs to be examined. We need to be certain that we understand what it is we're trying to do and what it is we're working towards. And I think this picks up on Nicole's point. So what's the truth of this? So 2 degrees is a policy truth. It's not an intrinsic characteristic of the climate system, the processes that are happening out there. It's a story we're telling. And if it's a fiction, that's fine, but it needs to be recognised as a fiction. And we need to hear everyone's fictions around this.
Okay, thanks. Are we ready to go over to Diana?
Okay, Diana, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you.
We can hear you perfectly as well. So, are we okay to hand over? The floor's yours, Diana.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, having been one of Kevin's co-conspirators on 4 degrees, it's really great to be able to participate in this radical emissions reduction conference. And although I'd like to see everybody in person, by staying here in Tucson, more than 5,000 miles away from London, I've saved the planet several tons of CO2, and it actually has contributed to my personal radical emission reduction from 2012 to 2013. Brenda and Kevin would be happy to know I've gone from more than 50 to less than 20, which of course isn't enough, but I reduced my flying from 100,000 miles to 20,000, eat less meat, and I put in a better AC and heating system and some solar. I have lost my elite status on the airline though. As most of you know, my research has mainly focused on climate impacts, adaptation and carbon offsets. But when I moved back to the US from the UK 5 years ago, from a country with about 10 tons per capita emissions to 20, according to WRI, I vowed that I'd get more involved in research and policy on climate mitigation in the region where I live, which is the US Southwest. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. I'm going to draw, hang on, let me just get my slides going. I'm going to draw on 3 reports, 2 of which I was involved with. One is the assessment of climate change in the Southwest that came out earlier this year. The other was the America's Climate Choices National Academy report, which I was involved with a couple of years ago. And then there's actually a very helpful report from WRI that came out just a few weeks ago that I'm going to refer to, can the US get there from here? And they're all available for a free download. So let's take a look at what's been happening with US greenhouse gas emissions. And I hope this is useful because, of course, the US bears disproportionate responsibility for global emissions, with 15% of the world's total emissions, only 5% of the world's population, 22 tons plus per capita compared to the world average of 6.5. But for better or worse, the US is a powerful force in global environmental governance, and in some cases, technologies that the US innovates on can transform the global economy and energy system, again, for better or worse. As you can see on these graphs, overall, US greenhouse gas emissions have increased by about 11.5% since 1990, but they've been going down since 2007, and it's not just because of the recession. The carbon intensity has improved a lot, from about 750 tons per million of GDP in 90 to 528 in 2010. But then a lot of countries have done that as well. We're about 80% of our emissions are fossil fuels, 40% from the power sector, 30% from the transport sector. The decline in emissions, or the levelling off, is partly explained by the recession, you can see here, and by falling energy demand that was associated with it. But it's also part of a long-term trend which reflects the rising share of natural gas and renewables in the US domestic energy portfolio and the implementation of stricter auto efficiency standards. But the analysis shows here that the shift to gas and to energy efficiency, they're most important in levelling off, but the shift to gas is actually preventing a decline in emissions. So I took on the challenge of trying to think about what a radical emission reduction would look like for the US and for the region where I live. I used the estimates. Actually, I think the US should probably be doing even more than this, but I tried to look at the 8% a year reduction. That would require a reduction of 500 million metric tons per annum to bring us down from where we are at 7,000. A 60% cut in 10 years would be 2,800 million metric tons. Is this possible? Well, what you've heard is that the US administration is trying for a much lower estimate of 17% cut in emissions from 2005 to 2020, but some states have much greater ambitions, such as California. So I'm going to take a look now quickly at some of the options for radical emission reductions in the US. I'll start with looking at closing coal-fired power plants. I'll look at the potential for renewables. Then I'll talk a bit about the WRI report, where they look at what can be done with existing authorities and without carbon markets. And actually, I'll probably skip the lower abatement potentials. So, one of the projects I've been working on is exploring the geography of emissions in the US using the EPA's new inventory of major point sources. For the last 3 years, all major emitters over 25,000 metric tons of CO2e are required to report. That's about 8,000 facilities shown here on the map. So if you take a look at this geography of the reported emissions, about 10% of the sources produce 75% of the emissions, and they're mostly coal-fired power plants. This is in the EPA database. But that's still a lot of facilities to focus on closing. If you're looking at 800 thermoelectric power plants, that's a lot to look at. And I've done a few estimates about what sorts of actions might take place, and some people would think closing 40 of these plants would be a radical action. It only saves you about 500 million metric tons, 7%. If you closed 100 power plants, you'd save about 1,000 million metric tons. And that's about a third of the reductions that you'd need for a radical reduction scenario. So when I look at people like Bill McKibben and Jim Hansen, who are focusing on getting rid of coal, it definitely would take us part of the way there, but we've got a very scattered geography that has some important economic implications there. The overall share of emissions is about 25% from the coal plant. So let me turn now briefly to the WRI report, which isn't as ambitious as a radical reduction, but it's interesting because it looks at how much existing federal law and state action in the US could contribute to greenhouse gas reductions. And as you know, with the failure of cap and trade, the Obama administration has been working within the agencies and with the executive branch. And interestingly, this is mostly a regulatory approach, which some of the rest of the talks have talked about. So what WRI look at are three scenarios, and there's really only one worth looking at in this conference, which is the go-getter scenario. So the current US federal commitment made in Copenhagen was 17% from 2005 to 2020. WRI looks at how we get a 40% reduction by 2035. There is some optimism on their scenario. They actually think that it's possible and that we will reach both the 17% and the 83% scenarios with actions that can be taken by the president, some of which are already underway, but only with congressional action or technology deployment do we think we can really get to the 83% goal, or for our purposes, radical reduction. So they've looked also at what the states can do, and if you look here, that takes us a bit further. There's an additional set of go-getter cuts that could be made at the state level, which would bring reductions compared to 2005 to 19% by 2020, 41% by 2035. And many of these are already in place, and I think many of you know the aggressive actions that California has taken in terms of reduction, and because California is such a big share of the US economy, that actually has a national level effect. So in terms of the near-term opportunities, just to summarize what's being done, in terms of the federal action, the EPA attempt to control emissions through regulation under the Clean Air Act. It's been challenged but is currently going ahead. The problem right now is it's only being implemented for new plants which require a CCS equivalent of a 90% capture rate. but it would be under the proposals, if they acted more aggressively, you could actually get a 74% cut in power plant emissions by 2035 if you're just using the Clean Air Act. They're also starting to regulate HFCs under the Clean Air Act. The natural gas emissions need to be controlled, particularly methane. And then where we're really seeing some success is with the higher energy efficiency standards. There's been quite a shift in the appliance standards, both self-regulatory by industry and by government. But the most interesting thing about the recession and the bailout here was that it was able to negotiate a deal with Detroit to double the efficiency of the car fleet by 2025. All the problems of turnover and so on. And then at the state level, you've got renewables obligations. In a lot of states, unfortunately my state's trying to pull out of that right now. We've got requirements for low carbon fuels, energy efficiency, building standards, CHP. Just to take a quick look at some reports on the West on the renewable potential. This is a study by NREL showing the enormous potential for wind and solar across the West. A recent report showed that we could quite easily integrate 35% wind and solar into the grid without any major infrastructural change through operating changes, etc. And that would reduce emissions from the grid by up to 45%. This, I think, is all reasonably good news. Of course, as you know, there are lots of challenges to climate policy in the US and to energy policy, the well-funded opposition to emission reductions, the controversies over the role of nuclear in a low-carbon portfolio. Arizona's half nuclear at the moment. There are issues about the energy mix and the smart grid distribution issues. And then, of course, the embodied emissions. And latest studies suggest that overall that increases US emissions by about 10% because we export a lot as well. And then what I want to end with is talking a bit about equity in the low carbon transition and some of the issues it's raising for us in the Southwest as a research centre. And what I want to talk about in particular are the two biggest point sources in the American West. These are the generating stations, Four Corners and Navajo Generating Station in Arizona and New Mexico. Together they produce 34 million metric tons. That's way bigger than Drax, for example, which is, I think, is the biggest in Europe. But they sit on the Navajo Nation, which has some of the highest levels of poverty in the US. 40% unemployment, 30% of the population in poverty. The energy from these generating stations and the coal, which is also mined on the reservation, does provide quite a lot for the Navajo. 2,500 people employed, $200 million in wages, $60 million a year in fees to the Navajo Nation, and under their new arrangement, they'll get even more. The only other significant source of revenue is actually casinos, and the estimate is that the indirect jobs are 5,000 and above. So the question, and a lot of the energy actually from Navajo, shown here, is pumping the water to southern Arizona in a sort of an irony linking mitigation and adaptation. So what we're trying to think about is how we can identify options that are lower carbon and climate adaptive for the Navajo Nation, that respect their sovereignty, their right to use their coal, and that would maintain jobs and revenue. The NREL report shows that it is possible but expensive to replace the jobs and the revenue from Navajo generating with solar. There are attempts on the reservation to demand green jobs and the closure of mines and power stations, but the nation's just extended the lease to 2044, with revenues increasing to 43 million. There are agreements to reduce emissions by 11.3%, that's by about a third, by 2035 at a rate of 3% per annum. But one of the most interesting things that happened is that Nevada and California have just decided to divest because of climate policy. The EPA has committed to putting $1 billion into trying to move towards conversion. So with that, raising both what's been happening, what the possibilities are, and some of the environmental justice issues, I'll say thank you from actually a beautiful dawn here in Arizona. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to follow Brenda's lead and take questions for our remote speaker first. So if there are a couple of questions for Diana, and I will recount them back to her through the mic on the laptop. Yep, if we could take that question, please, Claire. Diana, can you hear me okay?
You'll have to repeat it for me.
Yeah, but you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, that's super.
Okay, Becky Willis from Green Alliance. Really simple question. You've told us what the policies could be, but how are the politics looking?
Okay, did you hear that?
No.
So you've told us what the policies could be like. How are the politics looking?
I think the politics are better than they were a few years ago. The majority, John Krosnick's work shows that the majority of the American public want the government to do more on climate change. More states are taking climate change more seriously. And there is some indication that whichever party you represent, talking about climate change is less of a risk than it used to be. But I still think we're a long way from congressional action. But what's so interesting, from my point of view, is the amount of progress that could be made by executive action without going to Congress, and that the Supreme Court has held up the EPA regulations. So it's interesting, I think, the way the US is dealing with emissions in a regulatory fashion, but how much further it could go, I think, is a big question.
Okay, thank you. If there's one more quick question, I'll take it, and if not, I'll move to the other panellists. Yeah, there's one at the back there. Thank you. Please be brief to help me out with repeating it.
Yes, hello, Edward Sears, University of Exeter. My question for Diana is, to what extent does this hang on a phrase that came from Google, which is renewable energy cheaper than coal?
Okay, so to what extent does this hang on a phrase that came from Google, renewable energy cheaper than coal?
Well, again, it's partly about cost, but when you've got both states actually regulating the carbon content of fuel that can be sold into their state, there are institutions at different scales that are making regulatory decisions, even if it's going to cost a little bit more. But in the West, the cost of renewables is dropping, and the potential is enormous. There are still some breakthroughs. So, ironically, in southern Arizona, it's actually too hot for some of the solar to be as efficient as it could be. So we need some technology breakthroughs, but people are working on that. I think in the East, it's a little bit more challenging. We've got, like in Europe, opposition to renewables from people concerned about biodiversity impacts. But the NREL study really showed a lot of, or the NREL work has shown a lot of potential for renewables to work here. There's a lot of places we don't have the feed-in tariff, etc. But I think there is potential, and with the regulatory room, the market costs are incorporated in different ways.
Okay, Diana, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
Okay, so other questions for the panel, please. Okay, can I just ask, if any of you have not yet asked a question, are there any hands for people that haven't asked a question? Yeah, okay, so can we go left here, please? My left.
I'm Pedro from Thinkers Bubble. Nicole, you said there's no examples to follow. Do you not think we can take some examples from the pre-industrial revolution times and use those for the future?
Okay, hang on for that one. Okay, any other hands of people who haven't asked a question? These two gentlemen here, please. One near you, Phoebe, and one on the other side.
Noam Burbin from University of Oxford. Also for Nicole, thank you for that evocative presentation. On the one hand, we have this philosophical idea of a shift in consciousness we don't know to where. On the other hand, we have the very physical reality of climate change and only so much carbon we can emit. Do they necessarily meet somewhere?
Thank you. And the other question, please?
Yeah, Andy Middleton from Natural Resources Wales. Question for Nicole. What are the kind of practices that you would advocate as working on and taking that out to our colleagues to help people get into the mental space to imagine the kind of things that are possible? Seems that one of the big barriers is the lack of ability to separate, could it be done, and what would it look like from how we would do it? And how do you get into that place for radical imagination beyond that incremental?
Okay.
Well, about this, on the one hand, having shifting consciousness and having a physical reality, I don't believe in physical reality. It's all constructed. It's all the way we perceive it. Yeah, think about that, I would say. Your question on praxis, yes, we need a lot of ability, and that's why if we want to implement this, a lot of has to do with education of children, I think, of showing that there is a different way of looking at human nature, away from the fact that we are conflictual animals, into a way of that we can cooperate, because this influences everything. And if we want to really cooperate and have the ability to listen to other people, we shouldn't do that because it's in our own benefit. No, it's because we actually want to learn and we acknowledge that we don't own the solution. That's why I don't really agree with the question that was said before, when I thought about it. Because to say that, yes, radical change is good, but let's hang on to these and these things because these are good. This is already, this kind of desire for going back to what was there is already limiting the possibilities that can actually emerge. And perhaps these fundamental norms and values are good. I'm not saying they're not per se, but we should allow to think that individualism has some kind of basis in this idea of human being as conflictual and contextual This also means that we should maybe analyze the way we look at democracy, because we say that is a good thing to hang on to, but I don't think so. We should be able to recognize that we have to re-examine every value and every understanding that we have if we want to have a radical solution. And the first question was, why can't we have examples from before the Industrial Revolution? History is, the way we see history now is a way of one thing happening on top of the other. So any example that we see now, we relate that to what was previously there. So the change is always related to the episteme before, or the way it's always it's a linear way of looking at it. We cannot escape this kind of linearity of thinking. So that's why any example looked at from today's point of view, we already have our episteme from now. This is how we look at it. We cannot pretend that we can truly understand what it was to think of the Earth as the point, the center of the world. We cannot. So therefore the change that happened, we don't know if it was radical, probably, but only for the person, Badiou calls it the loyal subject, the person or the group or the institution or the nation in which the change was actually happening. At that moment, there is a radical change, but not if we look at it from now, our perspective.
Okay, thanks. I'll just take a couple more questions or comments. So one here, please.
John O'Neill from Manchester. I'm a philosopher, so I don't want philosophy to get a bad name at this conference. So I want to say some things which are quite contrary to what you said. I mean, A, there is a physical reality. And it's because it's a physical reality with CO2 arising that we have the problem. Secondly, I don't think things lie in the changes of consciousness as such. So one of the great mistakes philosophers make, I call it the ethicist fallacy, is because something's bad, you think the change has to be a change in values. I know lots of people who've got great values and have huge emissions footprints. The main way you can predict emission footprint is how wealthy people are. And it's about political economy, it's about redistributing wealth and actually taking wealth off the very rich, right, cutting their wealth, and not only just redistributing it down, but making for a different world where we consume less. And consuming less is about physical realities. And I think until we start thinking of economies as physical groupers and get away, and what you illustrated for me is exactly why radical constructivism is such a bad thing to introduce into a debate like this, because what you're doing is denying the problem that we start with. So and finally, I think you've got to think about possibilities, not impossibilities. So there's demanding the impossible in terms of thinking about how we break out of what is seen as politically and socially possible. But we've got to think in terms of real possibilities of radical social change now. So thank you very much.
And I'll take one more comment from this gentleman at the front. Phoebe, no, sorry, this gentleman at the front. Can I just ask that you be brief, and I'll give our panellists a very brief moment back.
Yes, indeed. A quick one for Chris. I wonder what you make of the optimistic book that Jonathan Porritt has just produced called The World We Made, looking back on a world where his scenario is that things get so bad between now and 2025, roughly, with food riots and famines and this and that governments are forced into the necessary policy changes and, of course, introduce the necessary technologies to produce a sustainable world by 2050. It's an unusual book in being so optimistic, and I gave it a glowing review. I just wondered if you had any views on it or had seen it.
Okay, Chris, you want to go first?
No, I must profess ignorance, so I can't really critique it. But I do think that I guess this debate about what stories we tell about the future, which I think comes around, whether you like constructivism or not, we're living with a constructed view of the world that everything's fine. The 2 degree thing was just to buy time while they look for techno fix. They haven't found a techno fix, so now we have to live with 4 degrees, etc., etc. So we are living in a constructivist world, and we've got to challenge that somehow. That is, we are people who tell stories, and which is not to deny the reality of climate change, otherwise I wouldn't be here. But I think, and that's what comes to your point. I think, we really do. Recently with the James Hansen paper and the 1 degree thing I was on, Ben, I was really sort of fretting about that. Just sometimes it just strikes me just what is at stake here and how bad things are going to be. And I think everything is up for grabs in that scenario. And I'm afraid that Jonathan Porritt has been a passenger in a journey to this crisis now. And I can't really find myself turning to him for guidance about how we go on from here.
Nicole, just if you want 30 seconds, a quick rebuttal. Or...
Well, I just wanted to thank you for your comments, and I would respond with a question that if you say that I deny the problem, what is your definition of the word radical?
And on that note, I'm afraid I'm going to have to close it, but you can perhaps discuss that further at the poster session. So thank you to all of our panellists, and if the next set could come up, please. to go first, so I'll hand over to him.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about some work which myself, Adam Corner and Lorraine Whitmarsh at Cardiff University and Irene Lorenzoni at UEA have been developing over the past few months. We're looking to do a couple of things with this work. First of all, to critique the achievements of the social sciences to date in effecting emissions reduction, and secondly, to propose some future directions of a more radical nature. And I should point out, it's important to point out that when I refer to the social sciences in this talk, what we're concerned with specifically are approaches which aim to directly influence the way people live their lives, so to change behaviours or lifestyles or social practices. So three of the authors of this work work in a psychology department. There are, of course, a number of other academic traditions which can be called radical in other respects, but I just want to be clear that our concern here is with efforts to target people's actions with deliberate interventions. Okay, so for quite some time we've known that there is a need for behaviour and lifestyle change for the purpose of addressing climate change. And as a result, there have been a variety of attempts over the past 20 years or so to try to encourage, cajole, persuade people to reduce their personal contribution to it. And we know from a number of reviews now that it looks like on average these sorts of interventions can achieve around about a 5 to 10% reduction in energy use and or carbon emissions. Of course, the research as a whole over this time period has provided a range of conceptual and theoretical insights into the contexts and drivers of behaviours, so that's been important. But this said, and as a number of critics have now pointed out, there has been quite a dominance in the literature and in policy on approaches which tend to consider the individual in isolation from their social context. In addition, most of the research carried out so far has targeted direct emissions, or the particular issue of recycling. Very little work has so far tried to influence people's choices with respect to indirect emissions. And there's also been a tendency to target behaviours which are easy to alter, so which are simple and painless. And the problem with this is that small actions only have a limited effect on emissions, even if they are successfully scaled up to national level. As well as these limitations, there are also a number of other constraints and obstacles to changing behaviours and lifestyles. First of all, changing behaviours is hard. There are multiple barriers at the individual and social level to bring about behaviour change. People are not easy things to change, as most of us know from our everyday lives. Academically, there's also been a certain amount of tension and disagreement between those research paradigms which are interested in bringing about change in people's behaviours and lifestyles. And I think it's worth pointing out as well that much of the research carried out in psychology and the social sciences has not really been designed to actually bring about behaviour change in any case. Rather, it's been designed to test theory or develop models. And finally, there's been an understandable bias so far towards using approaches which are politically and economically acceptable. So the upshot of these conditions that I've described taken together is that there's been a tendency towards promoting uncontroversial changes such as recycling, switching appliances off standby, turning the tap off when you brush your teeth, these sorts of things. Whereas the more important things like changing diet, addressing mobility, and challenging consumption and consumerism have tended to be overlooked. So we wanted to ask what a more radical social science would look like. Well, we're suggesting this would have the following three features. First of all, it would be clear that its main aim is to actually bring about behaviour and lifestyle change for the purpose of climate change mitigation. And as part of this, a more radical social science would be more vocal in advocating for particular types of change. There would also need to be a more explicit recognition that simple and painless needs to become large and difficult. And finally, we think there's a need for more integration across disciplinary divides, particularly between more behavioural and more culturally oriented approaches. Now, there was some comments just now about what radical really means, and there's obviously multiple meanings of this idea, but we feel that based on these conditions, we might conceive of a social science which is radical, first of all, in terms of attempting to substantially reduce emissions, but is also radical in terms of pushing at the boundaries of what are the normal and acceptable ways of bringing about changes in behaviours and lifestyles. Right, I'm a social scientist, so I like examples. So I'm going to give 2 examples of areas where we feel a more radical social science should focus. First of all, on mobility. Now, travel represents about a quarter of UK households' direct emissions, but nevertheless, it's one of the most unpopular ways of tackling climate change among the public themselves. Now, because mobility behaviours are determined by various individual, cultural and structural factors, changing practices in this area requires an integrated approach across those levels. So one behavioural measure which has been shown to be successful here, for example, is habit disruption. Some of you may have come across this before. This involves working with individuals when their routines are changing, such as when they're moving house or changing job. And research has shown that this can more than double the use of public transport. There are more cultural measures which can be implemented as well, things like introducing telecommuting in organisations or promoting car sharing. And these sorts of things have also been shown to be effective in changing behaviours. And structural measures as well have also been found to bring about changes in practice. So, for example, the introduction of the congestion charge in London cut traffic by about a third when this was first introduced. Okay, so whilst there is an evidence base, that there is some very interesting research in how you go about tackling car use and changing transport modes, there's very little work which has been carried out to explore how you alter flying behaviour. And yet this is a growing part of personal emissions, particularly among higher income groups. It's also strongly associated with cultural aspirations and changing social norms towards favouring frequent international travel. And so this makes it a very difficult challenge, but it's something we're suggesting that a genuinely radical social science would not shy away from trying to tackle. The second area that we feel is particularly important is emissions reduction with respect to consumption, by which I mean here carbon embedded in goods and services. Now, despite the fact that this is the ultimate source of the majority of households' carbon emissions, as illustrated by the figure at the bottom of this slide here, it's an area which has hardly been touched upon in attempts to try and encourage people to change their lifestyles and behaviours, at least from within the social sciences. And for this to be tackled in a more direct way, we think would again require changes made at different scales. In behavioural terms, this might involve things like the promotion of carbon literacy around food choices and other purchases, or approaches designed to promote particular types of values over others. At the societal level, efforts could be supported to scale up and extend community innovations for low carbon living. Now, structural measures are harder to envisage in this area, but one approach that a number of studies have considered in the literature is policy which sets about trying to reduce levels of meat consumption. And finally, there is a wider and important question as well about how bringing about lower consumption patterns would fit with the sorts of new economic perspectives that we've heard talked about today. So in summary, these ideas are intended to reflect our view that to meet the challenges of radical emissions reduction, in part at least through behaviour and lifestyle change, a major shift in approaches and emphasis would be required. Now, some of this could draw on established techniques and known best practice, but it would also be necessary to move into new and perhaps rather uncomfortable territory. There are, of course, difficulties in trying to implement this. How am I doing for time? Half a minute. Okay, I'll just rattle through these quickly. I mean, first of all, as I mentioned at the start, changing behaviour, particularly cultural norms, can be a very slow and difficult process. It's also worth bearing in mind that with any behavioural interventions, there's a risk of things like backfire and rebound. And certainly, there there's a question that challenging things like consumerism or the freedom to fly is likely to attract accusations of being hair shirt or fundamentalist. But that in itself is not a reason that, as social scientists, we shouldn't try harder to try and bring about change in these areas. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. We'll move straight on-ish to Mike Berners-Lee.
Okay, so I'm not actually a psychologist, so I'll keep my try and keep my message simple. But this comes out of having looked long and hard at climate change from a big picture perspective and from as many different angles as possible. So just to work up to my kind of one simple main message, just a really quick skim through some of the evidence so far. So some or all this a repeat of some things we've had in some ways, and this comes from some of the stuff that's in the first half of The Burning Question, which was the book I wrote with Duncan Clark. So here's our good old global emissions curve, and you can see that it's pretty well mathematically exponential, thanks to Andy Jarvis for fleshing this out. And it's doubling about every 39 years in both its steepness and in the total area underneath it, which is the amount we've burned to date. And this, you can see from this that nothing that we've said or done to date about climate change has made any, just to be very clear about this, any detectable dint whatsoever in that curve. Nothing at all. And it also tells us that efficiency and innovation in themselves aren't necessarily going to be the solution. We definitely shouldn't rely on them, because since 1850 we've had a lot of innovation and a lot of efficiency improvement. We've gone from candles to LED light bulbs and whatever. And it's the shape of that graph is very strongly suggestive of a global system dynamic at play, which needs breaking if we want to curb it. It needs breaking at a global system level. And we've heard the mention of interlocking tipping points, and that's probably what we need. So there's the emissions curve, and one of the things about I said this global dynamic. One of the things about it tells us is that in that time there's been a lot of local savings. We all know about local savings, but one way or another they're like squeezing a balloon, and those rebound effects are really, really important to look at. The sum total of the rebound effect on all efficiency and innovation year in, year out is about 101.8% rebound effect. That's a 1.8% backfire on average. So that doesn't mean to say local savings aren't really important, but it does mean we need to track them through to somehow we've got to understand what is their contribution to those interlocking tipping points that are going to break the global dynamic that is leading to an exponential rise. And if we can't believe in that link, then we shouldn't bother. And just to make this point about consumption, dealing with consumption, yes, that's right, but just to make this blindingly simple point that everything we burn, everything we dig out of the ground gets burned in order to meet human consumption needs. So if you add up the carbon footprints of our consumption, or you add up the carbon footprint of what we burn, or you add up the carbon that we dig out of the ground, they more or less all come to the same number, which tells us that actually if we can't slow down the consumption carriage of this runaway train without also slowing down the amount of fossil fuel which is coming out of the ground. So we've got to deal with that end of the debate, however hard it is. And then just very quickly, and we've had this. So the black blob is what we've burned so far, and I know we can argue about 2 degrees or whatever and probabilities and all the rest of it, but the big picture on this is that every 39 years. In 39 years' time, we'll have done another black blob, and that's too much for a reasonable hope of less than 2 degrees. And so we need to do something like that, and we know we need to do something like that. But what I'm really, and that's how much fossil fuel is in the proven reserves, thanks to Carbon Tracker for this kind of stuff. But that's how much fossil fuel is in the recoverable resources compared to the little blobs down the bottom are kind of how much we can really burn. And the point, none of this is actually particularly contentious in in some ways. I just want to talk just very quickly a little bit about renewables. So this is just breaking down energy from different fuel uses, different fuel types over the years. And so there's coal in black, and then there's oil, and then there's gas in blue, and then there's nuclear with its kind of the only one that's not going exponentially or vaguely exponentially. And then I don't know if any of you can see, but there's a tiny little red one down at the bottom there, and that's the renewables. So if we think that renewables are going to be it on their own, then we've got to believe in the renewables going right up by about here. Renewables have got to be right up in the rafters, and they've got to have not just gone up, they've got to have replaced all the rest and pinned the other ones down on the floor. That's what we're asking for that. So this is just for perspective. So there we go. We know all this stuff, but the real evidence I show you, and the reason I've put this on, is that all this is actually really, really clear. And it's so clear that it takes us to the crux of the problem, because none of for example, in the UK, I think it's clear to us, as I think this has come out two times today, none of the three main parties in the UK, for example, are anywhere near acknowledging any of this stuff in the debates that is going on. And if you look at the global politics on this, that's not almost all of that is not anywhere near acknowledging this stuff either. So the real piece of evidence that we've got to get onto is that the evidence is getting ignored. And that is the one thing that everybody in this room needs to pick up on, because if we believe in acting from the evidence, that is the evidence that we need to act from. So in other words, whatever we're doing, it's not working, and we need to try something different. There are various explanations for that. Well, climate change is too complex for the human mind to get its head around. It's too abstract. We're not good enough at abstract thinking. It's too far in the future, so maybe we need to be appealing to, getting people to ask, how are you going to explain yourself to your children or whatever. It's bigger than self, and some people say we're just too hardwired to be too small-minded. Maybe this is a chance to. Maybe what we need to do is just to tune into the big global tribe instead of the small local tribe. Too much vested interest, and no doubt that's a massive problem. And too uncomfortable to whistleblow, because if you whistleblow and you say that, say you're a politician and you blow the whistle and you say, look, all the three main parties are not getting onto the issue, then you have to leave the clan of people who are colluding and all that, and you have to join another clan, and that's kind of us, I suppose. And so far, our clan's not good enough. It's not attractive enough to join. So we need to get our clan together so that everybody wants to be part of it. And it's just, for today at least, it's too comfortable to carry on, and it's too uncomfortable not to. And I think the solutions are way too negatively framed, perhaps. So, all the opportunity, it's not as though we're fine-tuned to maximise well-being in the way that we do life in the 21st century. So, and there's tons of opportunity, but we haven't worked it up yet. Or perhaps we're just too stuck in these economic and cultural tramlines. So all these things are possible explanations, but whatever the reason, where we've got to is that the global brain isn't working properly at the moment. And rational analysis is absolutely not guiding action, and we need to be clear about that. And that's feedback that we need to respond to. So that's a challenge for all of us. And so what I want to say about psychology is that climate change is probably more a psychological problem for us, even more a psychological problem than it is a rational problem. And one way of looking at it is to say, well, maybe we should even be looking at it as a global mental health problem, in the sense that it's got this breakdown of rational analysis. Now I hesitate, this is what I really want us to pick up on. This necessitates a change of how we do it. That's a challenge for scientists, that's a challenge for any of us who are trying to communicate, anyone else who's trying to get things done. I don't have the perfect solution, but I do want to say that we need to focus on it. If I did have some thoughts, maybe some implications of it are, if we treated it, if we said like the brain's not working properly, rational analysis isn't working, how would we treat this as a global mental health problem? Well, we would stop trying to persuade through logic. we would try to be very clear and consistent and avoid collusion, which is massively challenging when the temptation to collude, and it's so insidious, is absolutely everywhere around us for all of us. And we absolutely need to find new approaches, and this has come up a few times today, really encouragingly. We need to find space to enable creativity and dreaming, because we've got to find ways out of the tram lines of whatever we're doing that isn't working, and we need to think differently. At Lancaster, we're trying our tentative approaches to trying to do that is to have a few times where we talk about a few things, and then we chat about a few things, and then we open some bottles of wine and we chat even more, and that's our way of trying to get some space in. But whatever it is, we've got to get space somehow, and we've got to slow down a bit. And we need to recognise that we need to have psychologically attractive solutions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll take one question whilst we get the web link sorted for our final speaker. So if there's one question, a hand shot up with great enthusiasm there.
It seems to me that is it not the case that it actually isn't a psychological problem? It's a political one about those in power having the money to think that when climate change does turn up, if indeed it does, because they have a cognitive disconnect a little bit, but they think they'll be able to buy the way out of it. When the food supply fails, they're rich enough to go and buy some food. When it gets too warm, they'll be rich enough to turn up the air conditioning. And that the people making decisions on behalf of the rest of the planet are those that feel they're able to buy themselves out of the problem. And that maybe we just need to stop thinking that they're going to sort it out for us.
Is there another question? I'll come to the front, please. Where have the mic people gone? Have you gone to sleep?
No, it's here.
Oh, okay, it's there already. Sorry, it's me that's gone to sleep.
Actually, I was going to be really cheeky, and instead of asking a question, I was going to completely disagree with the last problem. I think the last comment. I think it is a psychological problem because politicians don't act until they feel that their constituents are jumping up and down about something. So, to be honest, I think we need to go back full circle. You know, having watched politics up front for quite a long time, I know that unless people are absolutely making this an election issue, if people think they're going to lose their seats over it, that is what's going to change things. So we do need to put power back in the hands of ordinary people, and that's why I would disagree and say that it is absolutely a psychological problem.
Do either of you want to come back on either side of that?
I just want to say thank you, Caroline, for that, which is about what I'd have hoped to say as well. And also that you politicians, you also have brains and you have a psychology as well. And we need to take account of.
That's very good of you to say. It's easy to say to Caroline Lucas, but yeah. I suppose that what I'd want to say is that, yes, I think it is a psychological puzzle. I mean, that's why I got into doing this research in the first place, because I think that psychology is at the heart of this, but also it's a sociological problem, a puzzle, whatever you want to call it. It's an anthropological puzzle. It's a political puzzle. So I mean, these things happen at different levels. You know, societies are made up of many individuals and many psychologies. So this operates at multiple scales, I think.
Sorry, I'll say one more thing, which it's a multidisciplinary challenge. It's every discipline you can think of. I mean, if it was just science, a mixture of science, technology, politics and economics, great, we'd all be on the case, we'd be solving it. But it's everything else as well, including psychology and probably art, which I know nothing about.
Thanks. Are we ready to go?
Yeah. Richard, can you hear us there? Yeah. Okay, and hopefully you can see Carly. She's just being passed the timing cards. So keep an eye out for those. As it is, you have the floor to speak now.
Thank you very much. My paper is really not the future so much as it is about the present, and trying to think of strategies that accept present constraints and work within them. I'm happy to be there, or here, or wherever I happen to be. And I should introduce myself. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I've been working on energy conservation and consumer culture for more than 30 years. Back in 1993, my coworker, Hal Wilhite, I'm not getting an advance on the PowerPoint here. There we go. My coworker Hal Wilhite and I got a small contract from the U.S. Department of Energy to study households that were more than 2 standard deviations above neighborhood averages for electricity use in Northern California. The households we visited were not the rich, but they were conspicuous wasters. They were heating and cooling their big houses even when nobody was home. They often had extra refrigerators, pool heaters, multiple TV sets, hot tubs, and even private suites for their children. What impressed me the most is that the people who were in these houses were apologetic about it. They felt guilty, but they didn't feel guilty enough to actually do anything about it and change their behavior. So what I'm trying to get at here is what could possibly push them over the edge. Now, I did my dissertation research among a group of people called the Kekchi, who live in rainforests of southern Belize. And we anthropologists have spent a lot of time in villages like this. And a central issue is how so many of them remain egalitarian in the sense that nobody seems to have a great deal more wealth than the others. At the same time, simulations show that over a few generations, stochastic change should lead to a stratification of rich and poor. So why doesn't this happen? The answer is what anthropologists call leveling mechanisms. And we find a lot of different ones in different kinds of communities, as well as some in large states. The kind that operates in the villages where I work is a political structure called a cargo system, which requires men to go through a series of offices in church and village government. Each office requires a lot of time. The office holder usually has to help sponsor a fiesta in the community. And it usually took 2 or 3 years to accumulate enough money to take the next office. The higher you climb, the bigger the expense. In other words, to acquire political power in these communities, you have to spend yourself into poverty. This cuts the link between wealth and power, which seems to be so important in leading to social stratification. So what do people get out of this? The answer is they get the respect and admiration of their neighbors. Respect means a lot in this setting. If you don't serve, nobody will help you when it's time to plant your crops or when you need more hands to thatch the roof of your house. But the most important incentive is the public shame that families feel if they're not participating. People in the villages are very concerned about being like their neighbors, not impressing their neighbors with their wealth. And this egalitarian attitude has been called an image of limited good. People believe that if one person is getting rich, it must be at the expense of other people. Therefore, the rich are stealing from everyone. In the language of common pool resources, they're free riders. And people who are antisocial in that way are often ejected from villages or subject to other kinds of penalties as well. Yeah, economists and a generation of social scientists have been scoffing at this primitive belief generations because they believe it holds development back, and they've dismissed it under the label peasant conservatism. Or they simply saw it as a case losers envy the winners in an economic contest. But as villages get more involved in capitalist development and consumerism and they shift to wage work, there are plenty of goods outside the village and leveling mechanisms tend to fall apart. They learn that the economy is an endless cornucopia of products and all you need to get them is money. Cornucopianism says that this is rising forever, with all the costs paid by efficient machines and cheap energy. Well, as it turns out, I think at a global level, the peasants are right. There are limits to the global system, and there are costs to the endless shower of consumer goods from the mouth of the cornucopia. Someone is always paying, as in this case, the California Indians ended up paying for the millions of immigrants who came to California by basically being exterminated. And I think there's, in popular culture these days, an appreciation that the consumer cornucopia is not an endless font of good things. And this is a kind of radical reevaluation of the cornucopia by artist Bonnie Miller. I think that faced with a commons dilemma once more, we have a lot to learn from peasants, particularly about the social and economic power of shame. Today, the village has expanded, and the rich have found ways to live apart from the poor in exclusive communities and resorts, palatial mansions, and enormous luxury yachts. The super rich have multiple houses and apartments, and they hire others to do all the menial tasks of their lives. And the amount they spend is really quite astounding. Jackie Kennedy Onassis had a monthly clothing budget of $20,000, and she had a staff dedicated to getting rid of her many unused purchases from the warehouse where they stored them. You have to ask why the middle classes and the poor should be conserving while the rich climb to ever more outrageous levels of hyperconsumption. It's like selling sustainable development to the poorest people in the world while rich countries continue their wasteful and unsustainable ways. Shouldn't we be focusing our attention on the most wasteful among us, the ones who clearly do not care about their disproportionate use of the world's resources? In a very literal way, we have to live and breathe their waste. And addressing the extremes, we may have more impact on the mainstream. Shaming work as a practical strategy. Well, ask Amnesty International, which has used shame and transparency as tools of justice for many years. There is a growing number of organizations devoted to revealing and shaming the most destructive corporations. And there have been a number of success stories. I'm suggesting that now is the time to move to a smaller scale, to shaming individuals in front of their peers and public, making conspicuous luxury, like furs, disgusting rather than sexy. I have no illusions that this is going to be easy or instant, because we are flying in the face of about 200 years of consumer culture built on mass advertising and envy of fashion and luxury. I'm sure some of you are wondering if there's evidence that would support a strategy of shaming. There's good research by Willett Kempton and others showing that when individual electric bills also show the neighborhood average, high consumers tend to reduce, and in fact, almost all the people getting those bills tend to reduce. Many communities in the USA, South Africa, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand have published the names of water wasters and high consumers of water during drought. And here's a case from Portland, which has been doing this for about 7 years now, even though they're not suffering from a drought. They check every year on what has happened to the consumption of the top wasters from the previous year, and they applaud the people who have taken efforts to reduce their consumption. And they continue to shame the people who haven't cut their consumption or whose consumption is actually When high consumers cut their water use, it helps everyone serve because it makes the sacrifice seem more equal and more fair. And I think fairness is a really important word here. The primatologist Franz has recently shown that even capuchin monkeys have a sense of distributed fairness. And if you have not seen this video, it is completely convincing that these capuchins have a notion of fairness. And it's also hilariously funny. Granted that individual carbon emissions are harder to calculate than water consumption, I think it's still a practical task, and there are plenty of online tools to make it easy. If we can track the emissions of individual buildings, to do it for Johnny Depp, or for Johnny Depp's yacht, or his private island in the Caribbean. I envision a nonprofit organized along the lines of Amnesty International with a global network of volunteer researchers willing to track the mobile class, with the goal of calculating the size of individual carbon footprints, which can then be compared with local or national averages. And I'd also like to see a set of annual awards for the most outrageous wasters and emitters of the year, and the most useless new carbon, something like the Darwin Awards, or the Dubious Achievement Awards, or perhaps the Ig Nobel prizes with an edge. Now, strategy is going to make some people very upset, but this is not about scapegoating or an effort to absolve the masses by placing all the blame on a small minority. Instead, the goal is to make everyone aware that their consumption contributes to climate change, and that some kinds of consumption and some lifestyles are worth. I know this is an indirect way to cut greenhouse gas emissions, but telling people to be green only appeals to a small minority. And so far, it hasn't really led to major decreases in domestic consumption, especially here in the USA, where the pace of political change is so slow, you know, that we still have many state legislatures that are that don't believe in that global warming is happening, or that they can't see the evidence of rising CO2 emissions and rising CO2 in the atmosphere. So I'm thinking instead of taking political action, which could certainly take a very long time, to think instead about shifting popular culture, which now admires and emulates the increasingly outrageous consumption of the rich. Thank you very much.
Okay, Richard, can you hear me now? Richard, can you hear me? Okay, so he's spoken in his question time, so we'll just go.
I can now.
Okay. Right, great. We'll just take one quick question for you because we've run over a little bit, but I will repeat that question to you that we get from the floor because you won't be able to hear it. Okay, let's try. Is there a question for Richard? Yeah, Chloe, can you just go to that one there? Yeah, please.
Yes, Gavin Killip, University of Oxford. Is shaming a very small minority really better than building a strong vision of a positive future?
What was the word before future?
Positive.
Positive future, okay. What do you want me to ask me to do? Richard, can you turn your stream off because we're getting interference here?
Okay.
Okay, so the question is shaming a small
minority? Yes, I
minority?
can, but then I can't hear you. So I'll answer the question. I don't think shaming, I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. I think we need to pursue as many different lines of action as we possibly can at all different levels, because the problem is too encompassing and too serious. We don't have time to experiment to see what's working.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're going to move to other questions, but thank you.
We don't have time to experiment to see what's working.
Okay. Right, so a couple more questions from the floor before our poster session. Now I warned you about this morning, that all the hands would go up at this stage. We'll take a few questions, as a lot of it, I can tell already from all the hands, is going to have to be around the poster session. So can we go to the back right, please? And then Phoebe, will you take these two that are near you after that?
David Flint, Cass Business School. A simple question for Stuart. In the corporate world and in the business schools that look at the corporate world, there's quite a lot of practice and literature about organisational change, much of which is about changing behaviour and values. Have you thought about drawing on that for the work you're doing?
Just let me get the other ones first. Yeah. Okay. The next two here. Yeah.
Large maxi text, tradable energy quotas. We've got a poster in the next session. So my question is about, you talked about, I really appreciate both the talks, and I really think it's valuable, really important that we move on to looking at this kind of psychological change, looking at why, we've got the knowledge, we've got the science, why aren't we getting the changes we need? And I think something like tradable energy quotas offers a whole economy approach. So rather than trying to come up with policies which would just address diet, for example, or just address energy consumption through the bills, as we heard in the last talk, it addresses the whole kind of economy, and it does it in a way which looks at intrinsic values rather than extrinsic values. So I just wondered, and it also addresses the rebound effect, which again we've heard of 2 or 3 times. So I just wondered what your views were on that, and if we're talking about these problems, but actually there are some solutions out there which address a lot of these kind of different aspects of it. And just be interested to hear your comments on that.
And a final question for this.
Hi, Phil Corbell from the Carbon Literacy Project. Particularly Stuart, radical, making the small and painless big and massive. The Carbon Literacy Project addresses the bit about getting people on board at a mass scale, which so far has been about taking it to where people are, which is about sometimes the small, the easy to do to start the process, I would say. Or am I wrong?
Okay.
Okay, shall I start? Are you wrong? I think that's kind of an empirical question, actually. That's kind of avoiding the answer a bit, but I'll expand if I may. I think there are two ways you could look at approaching things via the simple and painless route. You could argue that by starting with simple and painless behaviours, then that can then build momentum and get people doing other things, and that's the kind of the thesis of spillover. I think the answer is why I said it's empirical. I don't think that in the research literature, at least, and maybe your personal experiences are different, that we really know that spillover actually works, because there's an alternative explanation, and that's that once people are doing the easy stuff, the recycling and the turning off the mobile phone chargers, then that kind of becomes a hook. That's what I've done my bit now. I don't then need to, now I turn my mobile phone charger off, I can do whatever else I like. So I think I would think the jury's out on that point. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
Do you want to say there was another earlier question for you about attitudes and values?
Yeah, can I answer the corporate world one? Thread a bit of the middle question, if I might say. On the corporate world point, I think certainly there is a tendency for psychology and environmental psychology to sort of caricaturing a bit, but to look at people in general, the public out there scurrying around, and so it's a very interesting point that you make about organisations and the sense that people in organisations, that's the kind of the match between the individuals and the structural setup. And And so, yeah, my short answer is yes, I think that would be more interesting to look at. It's not an area that I have pursued in any great detail.
Would you like to say anything about checks or any of those questions?
Yeah, well, so a few things. So what's the role of small actions? I mean, I think my take on that is that the small actions, they can be a start point. They can also disproportionately salve the pain and in doing so do more harm than good. So the really important thing about small actions is that without belittling them, it's really important that people understand how small they are and have a clear sense of perspective on that. Yes, we should. We've lost track a lot of our sort of intrinsic motivations, and the more we can build on that, the better. I don't agree that big actions have to be about more pain. I don't think this is a pain agenda actually at all. I think it's. I don't think I believe in that. Habit changing, yes, but I really do think there's tons of opportunity in it. I think we do tons of things at the moment that don't make us happy. I think there's good, clear evidence for that, and so there's at least as much opportunity in the kind of reinvention and reworking of things that we need to do for well-being as there is. I'm sure we could do it if we were smart enough in a way where the gains outweighed the pains for sure, but we need to work that up. We haven't worked it up enough.
Okay, on that note, I think because you guys have been sitting for so long now, I'm going to draw things to a close. I'd like to thank our speakers once again. We now have the wine reception, the poster session, hence what you're more focused on there. So that'll just be held back where we had tea and coffees and lunch. And please remember that it is a 9 o'clock start tomorrow morning, and we'll start very sharp. It's not 9:30 like it was today, it's 9 o'clock. Thank you very much.